අලුතෙන් SLT Mobitel Home 4G LTE connection ගන්නායට වටිනා tab computers සහ data දීමනා. අලුතෙන් SLT Mobitel Home 4G LTE connection ගන්නායට වටිනා tab computers සහ data දීමනා.
නව Tomex පැල්ලම් සහ විස බීජ අවම කර දින 3ක් දක්වා ටොයිලට් එක ෆ්‍රෙෂ්ව තමයි. Tomex.
In your headlines tonight, major hit. Global crude prices soar to $130 as Sri Lanka braces for impact. Rejecting interference, Sri Lanka receives a boost in support at the United Nations Human Rights Council.
We call on relevant parties to respect Sri Lanka's sovereignty and to stop politicizing human rights issues using human rights as a pretext to interfere in the internal affairs of Sri Lanka.
Tell us the plan. Exporters and industry chambers sound the alarm over triple crisis.
A certain amount of intervention is necessary, but we also feel that it should be driven through a free market economy.
If not the IMF, if somebody has a solution, then please tell us and we are willing to listen and work with you.
Towering above, Sri Lanka bids farewell to the majestic Nadungamuwe Raja. All this and much more coming up tonight on First at 9, this Monday, the 7th of March, 2022.
Introducing New Hellmann's, the world's #1 mayonnaise brand, now in Sri Lanka.
From AdaDerana, this is AdaDerana First at 9. Live from Studio 24 in Colombo.
And a warm welcome. You're joining us on AdaDerana English. I'm Indi Variamoth. Sri Lanka's most well-loved ceremonial tusker, Nadungamuwe Raja, who was the majestic bearer of the sacred relics during the Kandy Asala Perahara since 2005, passed away this morning at the age of 69 years. Following the Tusker's demise, President Gotabaya Rajapaksa has ordered the Secretary to the Ministry of Buddha Sasana, Religious and Cultural Affairs to declare Nadungamuwe Raja as a national treasure and take measures to preserve the Tusker's remains for display. Nadungamuwe Raja was the tallest tamed tusker in Sri Lanka at the time of its demise.
Born in 1953 in Mysore, India, Nadungamuwe Vijay Raja, well known as Nadungamuwe Raja, was just a calf when it was gifted to Sri Lanka, along with another elephant calf later named Navam Raja, to a monk residing in Piliyandala who is said to be a famous indigenous physician. In 1978, this 25-year-old tusker was acquired by Dharma Vijaya Vedaralahami, who was an eminent Ayurveda physician in the area of Nadungamuwe during that time to join his elephant herd. Since then, Raja was looked after carefully by the Dharma Vijay family and 4 mahouts have been deployed so far to treat him, with the latest being the mahout Wilson Kodituwaku, alias Kalumama. Towering around 11.1 feet or 3.37 meters in height, Nadungamuwe Raja was known as the tallest tame tusker in Sri Lanka. In 2005, this great tusker was privileged to carry the sacred relic casket of the Kandy Asala Perahara. Except for 4 instances, Nadungamuwe Raja has continued to carry the sacred relic casket since 2005. For all these occasions, Raja used to walk around 90 kilometers from Nadungamuwe to Kandy, amounting to an estimated 25 to 30 kilometers per day. Further, armed guards were also provided for the tusker by the government to ensure its security while it was travelling on the roads. After rendering its service for 17 years to the Temple of the Tooth Relic, the iconic tusker's life journey came to an end this morning at the ripe old age of 69 years. Following the news, many people flocked to the residence of the present owner of the tusker, Dr. Harsha Dharma Vijay, to pay their final respects. Further, Diyavadana Nilame of the Temple of the Tooth Relic in Kandy, Pradeep Nilangadayala Bandara, also arrived in Nadungamuwe to pay his final respects to the majestic tusker. In the meantime, President Gotabaya Rajapaksa has ordered the Secretary of the Ministry of Buddha Sasana, Religious and Cultural Affairs, Professor Kapila Gunawardana, to declare Nadungamu Raja as a national treasure. The head of state also issued instructions to conserve the Tusker's remains so that it can be placed on display for future generations. The final rites of Nadungamu Raja was conducted this evening at his place of residence. Majestic Nadungamu Raja, may you attain the supreme bliss of Nirvana.
While people across the country have been continuing to queue outside filling stations, in the past week, the price of a barrel of Brent crude in the global market rose to its highest in 14 years today. With that, a price of a barrel of Brent crude was quoted at $130 when markets opened. Now, the price of a barrel of Brent crude was last recorded at $112 on Friday. Due to this, the Ministry of Power states that measures may have to be taken to revise and restructure fuel prices in the country. Meanwhile, Minister of Power Gamini Lokuge says that measures are being taken to ensure that there will be no more queues outside filling stations from Wednesday. Further, the Ministry of Power went on to say that an oil tanker carrying 38,000 metric tons of diesel arrived in the country today and that the payments will be made tomorrow. And now joining me tonight in our studios, I have with me the former Minister for Energy, Chandima Veerakkodi, who is also an MP in the ruling governing party. A very warm welcome to our studios, former Minister.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me on your studio.
So I think in 14 years, fuel prices, crude prices world over has soared to its highest, $130 a barrel right now. Sri Lanka is grappling to sort out the issue to manage the current demand. But we remember during your tenure too, there were price hikes, but not an unprecedented situation as this. What are your thoughts? How should we go in for a restructure? Do you think fuel prices here should be increased, or should it be managed otherwise?
Well, if we have a vision in the government, and if the government has really understood the priorities, they would have had a program. But now this has come quite unexpectedly. So I don't know whether the government had subsidized to that extent. So it is a decision that the government should take, whether they can look into the grievances of people who are really suffering at the moment. Otherwise, they should increase the prices and generate income for the government. So it is a decision for the government decision makers to decide. What I believe is the priority should be understood. First of all, we must have availability of fuel. Now the issue is not the price, non-availability. Then non-availability of fuel is due to non-availability of dollars. How are we going to address that immediately? In such circumstances, when prices reach up in an unprecedented manner, how are we going to face it? So I think the Minister of Finance, Governor of Central Bank, together with the Cabinet and the President, should have a strategy to resolve this issue.
You mentioned that there should be a prioritizing effort by the government. You are part of this government. Is there a strategy? Is there genuine interest or a coordinated effort? You said the central bank, the finance ministry and the cabinet should work together to find a solution here. And you mentioned that the grievances of the people should be understood. But again, there is non-availability due to a forex crisis in the country. So Are all the essentials here together to address this situation?
Well, there is a routine committee that sits in the Ministry of Energy weekly. That is a stock review meeting. So when you sit at the stock review meeting, you get prepared as a team for 3-4 months ahead. Had that been properly done, I don't think you would have faced this situation, I must say, because that meeting is represented by the chaired by the minister, secretary is there, CPC is there, PSTL is there, IOS is there, CEB is there, and all the private power plant operators are there. And their requirements are taken into consideration, and based on that, the orders are made. So if that had been handled in a proper manner, I think you would have had to, first of all, face this situation. So otherwise, even from now, I think they should start that, and then the Minister of Energy should properly liaise and coordinate with the Minister of Finance, because the solution is not in the hands of the Minister of Energy. It is in the hand of the Minister of Finance and the Cabinet.
Are you saying?
I think this is a matter for them to
Are you saying there has been a failure from the part of these relevant ministries and authorities to address this situation, and the failure and this situation could have been averted with prompt and prudent measures taken earlier?
Absolutely, the President and the Cabinet should take the responsibility, because had this been handled in a manner that this would not have arisen, taking into consideration the availability, foreign market, and the availability of dollars, and the priority of and the importance of having fuel available right through this country. These have not been considered properly. I think that's the main reason for this crisis.
Very quickly, you have just a minute. I'd like to ask you, what next now for Sri Lanka? What do you think we need to do right now? If we failed before, if certain measures should have been taken, but that were not, what do we do now? What next?
Next, I suppose the main thing is to resolve this dollar crisis. In order to resolve that, we have to, first of all, we have been telling this to the government to try and restructure our loans, ask for some money to pay our installments, and at the same time find a way to get some dollars to have breathing space. The government will have to address those, and with that, most of the pressing issues can be resolved, as I see.
Thank you very much for your time here in our studios. And we take a short commercial break here on AdaDerana English.
Big 3.
Sri Lanka was at the receiving end of an overwhelming support at the United Nations Human Rights Council sessions today, where 45 countries expressed their views on the report presented by Human Rights Commissioner Michelle Bachelet last week. Of the 45 member countries, 31 spoke out in support of Sri Lanka, highlighting the fact that the Council's resolution that led to the written update did not have Sri Lanka's consent, which could set a dangerous precedent in terms of sovereignty.
Archbishop of Colombo, His Eminence Malcolm Cardinal Ranjit, addressed the 49th sessions of the United Nations Human Rights Council today, where he took up the issue of delayed justice for the victims of the Easter Sunday terror attacks. Calling the issue a serious violation of the fundamental rights of the victims of the attacks, His Eminence called upon the UNHRC and its member countries to support the continuation of evidence gathering initiated by the Council last year and devise a means to ensure the truth is finally revealed.
The first impression of this massacre was that it was purely the work of a few Islamic extremists. However, subsequent investigations indicate that this massacre was part of a grand political plot. Despite our repeated requests and those of civil organizations pursuing the truth, the incumbent government of Sri Lanka has failed to mete out justice to the victims. Instead of uncovering the truth behind the attack and prosecuting those responsible, there are attempts to harass and intimidate those who clamor for justice. As a result, nearly 3 years after the horrendous crime, we are still in the dark as to what really happened on that Easter Sunday.
Meanwhile, delivering her concluding remarks for the day, Deputy High Commissioner for Human Rights Nada Al-Nashif outlined measures that member states could choose to implement against Sri Lankans accused of human rights violations. These would include individual sanctions used by countries within their own jurisdictions. These, she added, could give victims a symbolic sense of justice.
With respect to accountability, because Sri Lankan domestic processes have repeatedly failed to deliver justice, the High Commissioner's reports have already elaborated a menu of options that can be pursued, including at the international level. These are not exclusive, they can be combined. Some accountability measures, judicial and other, are open to the use by member states within their own jurisdiction. We have already seen a number of cases in which Sri Lankan perpetrators from various sides have faced different forms of jurisdiction, including universal. Another option, of course, includes applying targeted individual sanctions to credibly alleged perpetrators of serious crimes. These should be considered for all parties responsible, both state and non-state actors. And there are examples of Sri Lankans being subject to travel bans. And while sanctions, even targeted, are important symbolically, they can also lead to a sense of justice for victims and their families.
Meanwhile, Sri Lanka saw overwhelming support against the resolution from countries representing the Global South. Of the 45 countries that spoke today, 31 expressed support for Sri Lanka's domestic reconciliation efforts. They also underscored the importance of the Council supporting voluntary national processes and also highlighted the fact that the Council's resolution that led to the written update did not have Sri Lanka's consent, which could set a dangerous precedent.
I note in particular the statement made by Catholic Cardinal Ranjith to the Council just a few minutes ago, highlighting the inadequacy of the investigations that have been carried out to date. While some people are now being prosecuted for their association with the attacks, victims have demanded that the government publish a full account of the circumstances that permitted those attacks, in particular the role of the security establishment. I note that additional evidence from the Presidential Commission of Inquiry into the attack has now been shared with Parliament. Publishing the complete findings of the Commission of Inquiry into the bombings is essential to ensure transparency for victims and also to pursue further independent investigations into the involvement of any other state or non-state actors.
We also appreciate the important achievements made in promoting reconciliation and reconstruction. In this regard, HRC Resolution 46/1 is not in line with the principles of impartiality, objectivity, non-selectivity and non-politicization, nor has it been endorsed by the country concerned. Therefore, it will only hinder the promotion and protection of human rights and national reconciliation in Sri Lanka. We call on relevant parties to respect Sri Lanka's sovereignty, political independence, and the path of human rights development of their own choice in light of their national conditions, to engage in constructive dialogue and cooperation, and to stop politicizing human rights issues or using human rights as a pretext to interfere in the internal affairs of Sri Lanka.
The Council resolution which gave rise to the written update does not have the consent of Sri Lanka. This creates a dangerous precedent requiring the office to collect criminal evidence for future prosecution, a mandate which was not given it by Resolution 48148 of the General Assembly, which established its mandate. Venezuela rejects any interference in the domestic processes of Sri Lanka as it moves towards a definitive national reconciliation. This Council must continue to support the efforts of Sri Lanka and its dignified people on the basis of genuine dialogue and cooperation.
The Human Rights Council was established to promote and protect human rights through cooperation and genuine dialogue to strengthen the capacity of member states to comply with their human rights obligations violations. In this regard, it is fundamentally imperative that the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights ensures that implementation and execution of its mandate is at par with the spirit, tenor, and letter of its founding resolution GA 6251. Needless to say that the sovereignty of Sri Lanka and indeed all member states can only be guaranteed by upholding the principles of universality, objectivity, and non-selectivity, as well as the elimination of double standards and politicization in this esteemed council.
Sri Lanka is a very close friend and neighbor of the Maldives. We believe that the country is well positioned to find solutions within its democratic processes.
This exercise is not something that enjoys the support of the country concern. We ought to be aware that any mandate of this kind will only contribute to double standards and politicisation which have begun to dominate this body and will in no way promote the enjoyment of human rights.
Joint collective of exporters issued calls for the government to help prevent the breakdown of industry by coming up with emergency solutions to the triple threats of power, fuel and forex faced at present. On the forex issue, representatives of the exporters associations urged the government to free float the rupee as a first step.
A joint collective of exporters associations is calling for emergency relief from the government to face what they say is a triple threat to the country's export performance. Speaking at a media briefing today, Chairman of the Sri Lanka Association of Manufacturers and Exporters of Rubber Products, Ravi Dadlani, called for serious intervention and for the forex rate to be free-floated.
So firstly, I think the exporters or the exporting community contributes to roughly about $15 billion worth of exports from Sri Lanka. And we have almost 50% of the workforce in Sri Lanka coming from the exporter community and connected exporter service providers. So this being the issue, one of the key leading issues that we have currently, as of today, our biggest issue that we have is if we need to keep our factories running and if we need to keep our export going, we would need to have power to be supplied to our factories, to the businesses that we run. And the power crisis at the moment is creating a lot of issues with regard to the stops, the starts, the production breakdowns, commitments that we need to keep to orders, etc., that are getting hampered because of the power issue. There is also a concern that some of the machinery that we have in most of the factories, particularly large rubber manufacturing or tire manufacturing companies, where some of the equipment that cannot be run without power, where you cannot run it on generators, and hence these are getting impacted, and the loss of production, the loss of commitments that we need to keep are getting impacted because of the power crisis. The other large issue that we face currently today is also to do with the fuel, where unavailability of fuel, transporting people for fuel, even if we have to run generators, and the unavailability of diesel is creating again a major production breakdown or major production constraint. Having said these two, we also feel largely that as of today, the issue is getting compounded mainly due to the issue with regard to the foreign exchange availability, and that going backwards with regard to the foreign exchange rate that is currently prevalent. And having said this, we feel that a certain amount of intervention is necessary, but we also feel that it should be driven through a free market economy if we are to take this or get out of the crisis that we are in.
And the joint chambers of industry have called on the government to explain what it plans to resolve the country's crisis if the option of going to the International Monetary Fund is off the table. Now, speaking at the media briefing today, chamber representatives expressed willingness to work with the government to get through the crisis if it was willing to share its options with the business community.
A media briefing was held this evening by the joint chambers of industry to voice their concerns with regard to the current state of the economy. Speaking at the event, business leaders called on the government to let them know what the alternative is if going to the International Monetary Fund is not an option on the board.
End of the day, we are the private sector. We know how to, we are entrepreneurs, we know how to do business. It's the government's job to make sure these things are looked at. The debt servicing, the foreign exchange, buying of commodities, etc., we believe is the job of the state. Anytime you reach out to the IMF, it comes with a whole load of conditions. But we are in a state, I don't think we have many choices. Our debt reserves are way below than 1, 2, 3 months, if it is. And I don't think it's any fault of anybody. I don't think we are here to finger point at anybody and say you did this wrong or you did this right. The pandemic was not anybody's fault. our tourism income not coming is not anybody's fault. It's been 2 years and we are just seeing light of tourism starting to happen. And there is an issue in the world with other issues happening around the world which may also curtail tourism coming to Sri Lanka. And if we continue with the current scenario of the fuel and electricity, etc., we may not have that tourism income coming, and we may not have our largest exporters being able to export and bring in those dollars. So one has to choose. We are in a state where we need some issue to resolve this issue. That's why I ended up by saying, if not the IMF, if somebody has a solution, then please tell us, and we are willing to listen and work with you, whatever that solution is. Because we as business people, we are ready to work with whatever solution. We just want our businesses and our employees to go forward. And we want to, as the private sector, help the government to come out of this issue. Our mission is to say, how can we help each other get along and go forward? We have had many discussions. Always the discussions have been very cordial. There are answers just like you said, the current governor is not in favor of going to the IMF for the various reasons. If that's so, then we need to see how else. We can't have a fuel crisis and a foreign exchange crisis and an electricity crisis if there is another solution. So that's where we are today.
Sri Lanka's and possibly one of South Asia's largest cement factories was inaugurated in Hambantota today. Now, the factory that boasts a production capacity of 4 million metric tons was constructed with an investment of $100 million by a local company and will be able to supply the local market with 28 million metric tons of cement annually.
Sri Lanka's largest cement factory was declared open at the Magampura Lanka Industrial Zone this morning by President Gotabaya Rajapaksa and Prime Minister Mahinda Rajapaksa. Built and operated by Lanwa Sanstha Cement Corporation Private Limited, the factory has been built on a land area of 63 acres with an investment of $100 million, of which the construction activities commenced in March 2020. The plant is supposed to be one of the largest cement factories in the South Asian region. The factory is capable of manufacturing all types of cement, including ordinary Portland, Portland composite and blended hydraulics. According to the factory management, its annual production capacity is 4 million metric tons, and under the first phase, 2.8 million metric tons will be supplied to the local market. Addressing the event, State Minister of Export Processing Zones D.V. Chanaka said that the government has undertaken the responsibility of producing essential goods and services locally to fulfill the needs of people while driving the country forward. He also said that 11 more export processing zones will be established in the country before the end of 2024 in a bid to strengthen the local economy by boosting exports. At the moment, there are only 14 investment zones in Sri Lanka. The President and the Prime Minister also laid the foundation stone for a proposed steel factory also by the same company, which will be built on a land area of 250 acres with an investment of $400 million. The manufacturing process of steel in the factory is scheduled to begin in late 2024.
Before we wrap up, we leave you with this. Sri Lanka's tourist experience is about to get a whole new aspect with Indian cruise line Cordelia Cruises announcing the commencement of cruises from Tamil Nadu to Sri Lanka from July. Local and international tourists will be able to travel from Chennai to destinations such as Hambantota, Trincomalee and Kankasanture in Jaffna along the way while enjoying a host of entertainment options on board. And that's all for tonight. Thank you for watching us. Have a pleasant evening.